The moment someone tells emergency responders where they can and cannot stand on your own property, you know the day is about to become unforgettable. Ryan Mitchell had expected nothing more exciting than organizing storage shelves inside his garage on a cool Saturday morning in Maple Grove Estates. The garage door was fully open, sunlight stretched across the concrete floor, and neatly labeled boxes lined one wall, while a workbench filled the other. He had just finished moving a heavy cabinet when he heard worried voices coming from the sidewalk across the street. A small group of neighbors had gathered around an older resident who looked uncomfortable and needed immediate assistance, while someone had already called emergency services. Ryan walked over without hesitation, asking if there was anything simple he could do while everyone waited for trained responders to arrive. One neighbor explained that the narrow sidewalk was becoming crowded as more people gathered, and another mentioned that the weather forecast called for light rain within minutes. Ryan looked toward his open garage only 30 feet away and immediately had a practical idea. He told everyone that if the emergency responders needed extra space or temporary shelter while assisting the resident, his garage was completely available. Nobody objected. In fact, several neighbors quietly thanked him because it seemed like the most convenient location close to the scene. Barely 2 minutes later, the sound of approaching sirens echoed through the neighborhood. An emergency response vehicle entered the community and stopped beside the curb. The responders quickly assessed the situation and noticed Ryan's open garage nearby. One of them asked politely whether they could briefly use the covered space to organize equipment away from the light drizzle that had just begun. Ryan answered without hesitation, "Of course. Please use whatever space helps you do your job." The responders thanked him and calmly carried a small amount of equipment into the garage while continuing to assist the resident outside. Everything appeared organized, respectful, and efficient. Several neighbors even stepped backward to make the driveway easier to access. For a brief moment, it looked as though the situation was under control. Then another voice interrupted the calm. "What exactly is happening here?" Diane Foster asked as she walked briskly down the sidewalk, carrying a clipboard beneath one arm. The longtime HOA president surveyed the scene before stopping at the edge of Ryan's driveway. Her attention immediately shifted from the resident receiving assistance to the open garage where emergency responders had temporarily placed their equipment. She frowned. "That garage is visible from the street," she said. "This creates an appearance that is not consistent with community standards." Several neighbors stared at her, uncertain whether they had heard correctly. Ryan remained calm and answered politely. They only needed a dry, convenient place while helping someone. Diane folded her arms. Homeowners are expected to maintain compliance at all times. Community appearance still matters. Ryan glanced toward the responders, who remained completely focused on their work, then looked back at Diane. "Right now, helping our neighbor matters most." Diane stepped one pace closer to the driveway and replied, "You should close the garage door immediately." The conversation instantly captured the attention of everyone nearby. More residents walked outside after noticing the emergency vehicle, while others paused during their morning walks to see what had happened. Within seconds, quiet whispers spread through the growing crowd as neighbors realized they were witnessing an argument that nobody had expected. Ryan took a slow breath, determined to stay respectful, but he also knew he was not about to interfere with professionals who had asked for temporary use of his garage. What began as a simple act of helping a neighbor had suddenly become the center of attention for the entire community, and nobody standing on that driveway realized the next few minutes would be recorded, remembered, and discussed throughout Maple Grove Estates for months to come. Light rain continued falling across Maple Grove Estates as more neighbors gathered quietly along the sidewalk, watching the emergency responders work with calm efficiency while using a small section of Ryan Mitchell's open garage to organize their equipment. The arrangement seemed simple and practical to everyone except Diane Foster. She stood near the edge of the driveway with her clipboard held firmly against her side, her attention fixed on the raised garage door rather than the activity taking place around it. "This needs to be closed," she repeated. "The association has appearance standards that apply to every property." Ryan looked toward the responders before answering in the same respectful tone he had maintained from the beginning. "They asked for temporary shelter because of the weather. They will be finished as soon as they are able." Diane shook her head. "Temporary or not, Visible storage areas and open garages are addressed in our guidelines. Several neighbors exchanged confused looks. Martha Ellis, who lived 2 houses away, quietly whispered to another homeowner, "This is not about storage. They are helping someone." Her friend nodded but remained silent, uncertain whether speaking up would only make the situation more uncomfortable. Ryan took another slow breath. "I understand the guidelines," he said. "Right now I would rather let the responders decide what helps them work safely." Diane responded without hesitation. "You are choosing to ignore my direction." Before Ryan could answer, one of the emergency responders walked toward the driveway to retrieve another supply case from inside the garage. Noticing the conversation, the responder politely thanked Ryan once again for making the covered space available and explained that keeping certain equipment dry made their work easier in changing weather. The statement was brief and professional before the responder immediately returned to assisting the resident. Several neighbors heard every word. Instead of easing the tension, Diane became even more determined. The association cannot simply overlook violations because circumstances become inconvenient, she said firmly. Ryan did not argue. Nobody is asking the association to overlook anything. I am simply allowing trained professionals to use my garage for a short time. By now, nearly a dozen residents had gathered nearby. Some stood beneath umbrellas while others watched from covered porches. A father walking his dog quietly stopped at the corner, and 2 teenagers paused their bicycle ride after noticing the emergency vehicle. As more people arrived, several instinctively reached for their phones. Nobody appeared interested in creating drama. They simply wanted an accurate record because the conversation had become increasingly difficult to believe. Diane noticed the phones almost immediately. "There is no reason to record this," she announced. A younger homeowner calmly replied, "We are only documenting what happens." That simple response encouraged even more residents to continue recording without saying another word. Ryan paid almost no attention to the growing number of cameras. His focus remained on keeping the driveway clear and making sure nobody accidentally blocked the responders moving between the sidewalk and the garage. Whenever another neighbor stepped too close, Ryan politely guided them back several feet so the work area remained open. The contrast became obvious to everyone watching. While Diane continued discussing compliance, Ryan continued thinking about cooperation. As the light rain became slightly heavier, the emergency responders moved another small equipment bag beneath the garage roof. One of them smiled appreciatively toward Ryan before returning outside. Several neighbors quietly noticed that simple exchange, and the atmosphere shifted. The growing crowd no longer seemed divided over whether Ryan had made the right decision. Instead, many had begun wondering why the conversation had ever centered on neighborhood rules while professionals were still actively helping someone just a few yards away. The steady drizzle continued for several more minutes before gradually fading, leaving the pavement damp and the air unusually quiet except for the calm voices of the emergency responders. Ryan Mitchell remained near the edge of his driveway, making sure the path between the sidewalk and his garage stayed completely open. Every time another curious neighbor stepped a little too close, he politely asked them to leave plenty of room, and every request was met with immediate cooperation. The atmosphere should have been calming down, yet the growing disagreement with Diane Foster kept drawing more attention than anyone expected. Diane glanced toward the open garage once again before speaking loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I need to remind you that homeowners are responsible for maintaining compliance at all times." Ryan answered without raising his voice. "I understand that, but they asked to use the space for a short time, and they are almost finished." Diane looked toward the emergency responders and then back at Ryan. "You should have asked the association before allowing this." Several neighbors exchanged puzzled expressions. Martha Ellis quietly whispered, "How could anyone ask permission during an emergency?" Her comment was soft, but enough people heard it that quiet murmurs spread through the crowd. Just then, one of the responders carefully carried another small equipment case from the garage back toward the sidewalk and thanked Ryan once more for making everything so accessible. The responder explained that having a covered location nearby had allowed the team to keep essential supplies organized while avoiding unnecessary delays caused by the weather. The statement lasted only a few seconds before the responder returned to assisting the older resident, but it left a noticeable impression on everyone listening. Diane appeared determined not to let the conversation end there. She opened her clipboard and began writing notes while occasionally looking toward Ryan's property. "The board will need to review today's events," she said. Ryan simply nodded. "You are welcome to review everything that happened." His calm response surprised several neighbors because there was no sign of frustration or defensiveness. Across the street, a delivery van remained parked while its driver completed electronic paperwork before leaving. The driver happened to notice the gathering and realized the dashboard camera facing Ryan's driveway had been recording continuously since arriving several minutes earlier. Without saying anything, he checked the recording indicator and quietly left the camera running. At nearly the same moment, Rachel Cooper stepped onto her front porch after hearing the discussion. She looked toward the driveway, noticed the emergency vehicle, and remembered that her doorbell camera covered most of the sidewalk leading to Ryan's garage. She quickly opened the camera application on her phone to confirm it was recording as usual. Neither she nor the delivery driver considered their recordings especially important at the time. They simply knew modern cameras often captured ordinary moments automatically. Meanwhile, the emergency responders completed their work and began preparing to leave. Before loading their final equipment case, one responder walked over to Ryan, shook his hand, and sincerely thanked him for allowing them to use the garage during the light rain. Several neighbors witnessed the exchange, and a few quietly smiled. Diane watched the interaction without saying anything, but she immediately wrote another note on her clipboard. As the emergency vehicle slowly pulled away from the curb, most people expected the unusual morning to finally come to an end. Instead, neighbors remained standing in small groups along the sidewalk, comparing what they had just witnessed, while more than one person quietly realized that several cameras from completely different angles had captured the entire sequence from beginning to end, preserving details that no single witness could possibly remember alone. After the emergency vehicle disappeared around the corner, the neighborhood remained unusually active instead of returning to its normal Saturday routine. Small groups of residents stayed near their driveways discussing what they had witnessed, and almost every conversation ended with the same question. Why had such a simple decision become an argument in the middle of an emergency? Ryan Mitchell quietly rolled a few storage bins back into place inside his garage, leaving the door open while the concrete floor dried. He had barely finished when Martha Ellis walked over carrying her phone. "I think you should see something," she said. Ryan politely smiled and answered that he was not interested in creating more conflict. Martha gently shook her head. "This is not about conflict. It is about making sure people remember what actually happened." Within a few minutes, Rachel Cooper joined them from across the street along with two other neighbors who had also recorded parts of the morning. They stood inside the open garage while comparing their videos, not to criticize anyone, but simply to understand the complete timeline. The first recording showed Ryan offering his garage before the responders even arrived. Another angle captured the responders politely asking permission to use the covered space because of the light rain. A third recording clearly showed Ryan repeatedly asking neighbors to leave enough room for the responders to move safely between the sidewalk and the garage. Every video matched the others. No matter which angle they watched, Ryan remained calm, respectful, and cooperative. Then Rachel opened footage from her doorbell camera. Because it had started recording automatically when people entered the driveway, it captured several moments nobody had noticed earlier. Before Diane Foster ever spoke to Ryan, she had walked directly past several concerned neighbors without asking about the older resident's condition. Her first words after reaching the driveway focused entirely on the open garage. The group watched the short clip twice in complete silence. Martha finally spoke. "That changes how this conversation started." Ryan remained thoughtful instead of satisfied. "Everyone reacts differently under pressure," he replied. "I just hope our neighbor is doing well." His response impressed the others because he still refused to insult Diane even after watching the recording. Just then, the delivery driver returned to complete another stop on the same street. Recognizing several familiar faces, he mentioned that his dashboard camera had probably captured the entire interaction from across the road. Curious, everyone walked over to his van. He replayed a portion of the video on a small screen mounted inside the vehicle. Unlike the phone recordings that began at different moments, the dashboard camera showed one continuous sequence from the arrival of the responders until they departed. It confirmed that the responders had used only a small section of Ryan's garage, that access to the driveway had remained completely clear, and that Ryan had never interfered with their work. One unexpected detail caught everyone's attention. The camera also recorded several neighbors quietly thanking Ryan while the responders were still present, something few people remembered because so much else had happened afterward. Martha folded her arms and looked around the group. If anyone ever questions what happened today, these recordings answer nearly every question. Nobody disagreed. As the neighbors thanked the delivery driver for sharing the footage, Diane drove slowly past the gathering on her way toward the community office. She briefly glanced at the small group standing together beside the van before continuing without stopping. None of them realized that later that afternoon a notice from the Homeowners Association would appear online announcing that the board intended to review the morning's events, setting the stage for an even larger confrontation built not on opinions, but on evidence preserved from nearly every angle. By early Sunday evening, the discussion inside Maple Grove Estates had spread far beyond the handful of neighbors who had witnessed the emergency firsthand. Residents who had been away that morning began asking questions after reading the Homeowners Association notice announcing that the board intended to review an incident involving possible community rule violations. Although the notice never mentioned Ryan Mitchell by name, nearly everyone understood who it referred to. Ryan spent most of the day cleaning his garage and answering friendly questions from neighbors who stopped by, but he consistently repeated the same message. He hoped the older resident was recovering well and believed that was the only outcome that truly mattered. His refusal to complain about Diane Foster surprised many people, especially after several neighbors admitted they felt the association had focused on the wrong issue. Late that afternoon, Martha Ellis invited Ryan, Rachel Cooper, Kevin Lawson, and the delivery driver to her covered patio so they could organize the recordings before the upcoming board meeting. Nobody wanted to create unnecessary conflict. They simply agreed that if the board planned to review the situation, every available fact should be presented in the correct order. Phones, tablets, and memory cards were placed across the patio table as they compared timestamps from each recording. Piece by piece, the morning came back together with remarkable clarity. Ryan offered the garage before anyone requested it because he saw the changing weather. The emergency responders later accepted the offer after politely asking permission. The equipment occupied only a small section of the garage nearest the driveway. The remaining space stayed completely open, and neighbors consistently left a clear path exactly as Ryan had requested. The timeline already seemed complete until Kevin received an unexpected message from one of the emergency responders. Earlier that morning, Kevin had politely asked whether the team could confirm that the garage had been helpful if the board ever requested clarification. The responder explained that official medical details could not be discussed, but there was nothing preventing a general statement about operational logistics. Attached to the message was a short written note confirming that Ryan had voluntarily allowed temporary access to a covered area during light rain, that the location helped keep essential equipment organized and dry, and that the arrangement did not interfere with emergency operations in any way. Everyone around the table became quiet. Rachel slowly read the statement a second time before placing the phone back on the table. "This answers the biggest question," she said softly. Martha nodded. "It is no longer just our opinion." Ryan remained humble despite the obvious significance of the message. "I appreciate them taking the time to write it," he said. "I only wanted them to have what they needed." Just then another neighbor, named Susan, arrived carrying printed screenshots from the community social page. During the afternoon, several residents who had witnessed the event had independently shared similar accounts describing Ryan's calm behavior and the responders thanking him before leaving. Although nobody coordinated their comments, they all described nearly identical details. The consistency caught everyone's attention. It became increasingly difficult to imagine how any alternative version of events could survive when so many independent sources pointed to the same sequence. As the evening came to a close, Martha carefully placed copies of the recordings, the written statement, and the timeline into a single folder. She looked at Ryan and smiled. "No matter what happens at the meeting, the facts are ready." Ryan quietly thanked everyone for their support before heading home, unaware that at nearly the same moment Diane was preparing her own presentation for the board, convinced she could still defend her decision even though the evidence waiting inside that folder had already begun changing the direction of the entire story. Tuesday evening brought one of the largest homeowner association meetings Maple Grove Estates had seen in years. Long before the scheduled start time, nearly every chair inside the clubhouse had been filled, and residents who rarely attended meetings quietly stood along the walls waiting to hear what would happen. The atmosphere remained respectful, yet there was an unmistakable feeling that everyone understood this discussion would shape how the community handled unexpected situations in the future. Ryan Mitchell arrived carrying a simple folder containing printed copies of the timeline, the written statement from the emergency responder, and several screenshots from the recorded videos. He greeted neighbors with a friendly smile before taking a seat near the center of the room. Diane Foster entered a few minutes later with her familiar clipboard and several neatly organized documents. She acknowledged the board members before sitting at the front table, appearing confident as the meeting officially began. Routine business moved quickly until the chairperson announced the final agenda item concerning the weekend emergency. Diane stood first and explained that her responsibility as HOA president required her to enforce community standards consistently. She stated that maintaining neighborhood appearance and order remained important even during unexpected circumstances because confusion could create additional problems. She spoke calmly and professionally, and several residents listened carefully without interrupting. When she finished, the chairperson invited Ryan to respond. Ryan stood slowly and thanked the board for allowing him to speak. He explained that the emergency responders had politely requested temporary use of his garage because light rain had begun and the covered space allowed them to organize essential equipment more efficiently. He emphasized that the arrangement had been brief, completely voluntary, and focused only on helping trained professionals perform their duties without unnecessary obstacles. He never criticized Diane or questioned her intentions. Instead, he simply described exactly what had happened from his perspective. The chairperson then opened the floor for supporting information. Martha Ellis approached with the organized timeline, while Rachel Cooper connected her phone to the meeting room television. The first recording showed Ryan offering his garage before the responders arrived. The next recording captured the responders requesting permission and thanking him afterward. Another angle demonstrated that neighbors consistently kept the driveway and sidewalk open while Ryan politely encouraged everyone to leave plenty of room. The delivery driver's uninterrupted dashboard footage confirmed the same sequence from beginning to end. As each recording played, the room grew noticeably quieter. No shouting appeared on the videos. No interference with emergency operations appeared either. Instead, every recording consistently showed calm cooperation. Then Martha presented the written statement from the emergency responder. The chairperson carefully read it aloud, explaining that the temporary use of the covered garage had helped keep equipment organized during light rain and had not interfered with emergency operations in any way. Several board members exchanged thoughtful looks before asking to review the statement a second time. One director quietly observed that the written confirmation aligned closely with every video already shown. Another board member asked whether anyone present had witnessed Ryan preventing responders from doing their work or creating confusion. The room remained completely silent. Finally, a longtime resident named Harold stood and addressed the board. He explained that he had lived in Maple Grove Estates for more than 15 years and believed the recordings demonstrated neighbors working together respectfully during an unexpected situation. He added that future policies should encourage practical cooperation instead of creating uncertainty when trained professionals requested reasonable assistance. His comments were followed by several quiet nods throughout the audience. As the discussion continued, it became increasingly clear that the meeting was no longer centered on whether Ryan had done something wrong. It had become a conversation about whether the association itself needed to rethink how it responded when common sense and community support mattered more than routine procedures. The meeting paused for several minutes while the board quietly reviewed the recordings one final time, and during that brief silence the atmosphere inside the clubhouse changed in a way everyone could feel. At the beginning of the evening, many residents had arrived expecting a disagreement between a homeowner and the association. Now the discussion had become something much larger. It was about judgment, priorities, and how a neighborhood should respond when unexpected situations demanded immediate practical decisions. Ryan Mitchell remained seated without speaking, allowing the evidence to speak for itself. Diane Foster sat at the front table with her clipboard closed for the first time that evening. She looked toward the television screen where the final frame of the dashboard recording remained frozen, showing the emergency responders carrying their equipment from Ryan's garage while thanking him for his cooperation. One board member finally broke the silence by asking a simple question. Did anyone present witness the homeowner interfering with emergency responders in any way? The question lingered for several seconds. Residents looked around the room, but nobody raised a hand. Another director followed with a second question. Did anyone observe the temporary use of the garage creating an unsafe condition or delaying the responders? Once again, the room remained silent. The absence of disagreement became more meaningful than any speech. Diane quietly explained that her concern had always been maintaining consistency with community standards and preventing situations that might become difficult to manage in the future. Her voice remained calm, but it no longer carried the certainty it had shown earlier in the meeting. The chairperson acknowledged her explanation before gently responding that every policy also required reasonable judgment when unusual circumstances occurred. Harold stood once more and thanked the board for taking time to review every recording instead of relying only on personal recollections. Martha added that the videos demonstrated something important beyond the specific incident. They showed neighbors cooperating respectfully without panic while trained professionals handled the situation. Rachel then pointed out another detail that many people had overlooked until the recordings were played in sequence. Every time Ryan spoke, he encouraged people to leave space, remain calm, and avoid blocking access. At no point did he challenge the responders or create confusion. Several board members quietly nodded while reviewing their written notes. The chairperson then announced that the board had reached a preliminary conclusion. Based on the recordings, the written statement from the emergency responder, and the consistent witness accounts, there was no basis for any compliance action against Ryan. A quiet wave of relief spread through the audience. No applause followed because the moment did not feel like one side defeating another. Instead, it felt like the community had collectively chosen accuracy over assumptions. The chairperson continued by proposing that the association develop a formal emergency response guideline explaining that homeowners could reasonably assist trained responders by providing temporary access to private property when requested, provided that such assistance remained safe and did not interfere with professional operations. The proposal immediately received support from the remaining directors. Diane listened without objection before slowly nodding in agreement. Although she offered no lengthy remarks, her expression suggested she understood the conversation had moved beyond enforcing ordinary rules. As residents began quietly gathering their belongings, many believed the evening had reached its conclusion. Yet, just outside the clubhouse entrance, an unexpected conversation with the older resident and his grateful family was about to remind everyone why the neighborhood would remember this meeting for years to come. As residents slowly walked out of the clubhouse into the cool evening air, the tension that had filled the meeting room seemed to disappear almost instantly. Small conversations formed across the parking lot, but unlike the anxious discussions from earlier in the week, these carried a completely different tone. People were no longer debating what might have happened because the recordings had answered nearly every question. Ryan Mitchell stepped outside expecting to head home quietly, but before he reached his truck, he noticed the older resident and his wife waiting near the sidewalk. The gentleman smiled warmly and extended his hand. "I wanted to thank you in person," he said. "Your garage made everything easier that morning." Ryan shook his hand and replied with a smile. "I'm just glad you are feeling better." The man's wife explained that one of the emergency responders had later mentioned how useful the covered space had been while organizing equipment during the light rain. She added that the calm cooperation shown by Ryan and several neighbors had helped reduce stress during an already difficult situation. Several residents standing nearby overheard the conversation, and their expressions softened even further. Martha quietly smiled while Rachel looked toward the clubhouse where a few board members were still gathering their papers. The contrast between the anxiety of Saturday morning and the calm understanding now spreading through the neighborhood could not have been greater. A few moments later, the chairperson of the homeowners association stepped outside and asked everyone for a brief moment of attention. He announced that after reviewing all available information, the board had unanimously agreed to close the matter with no violation, no warning, and no further action regarding Ryan. He also confirmed that the association would immediately begin updating its written emergency response procedures. The new guidance would clearly state that homeowners could voluntarily provide reasonable assistance to trained emergency responders when requested, provided that access remained safe and professional operations were not interrupted. Several neighbors quietly nodded in approval. Nobody cheered because the announcement did not feel like a contest. Instead, it felt like the community had learned something valuable together. Diane Foster exited the clubhouse a few moments later carrying her clipboard. She paused when she noticed the small group still gathered outside. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Then Diane looked toward Ryan and calmly said, "I hope future situations are handled even better because of what we learned." Ryan answered with the same steady voice he had maintained from the beginning. "I think everyone wants the same thing. We want our neighbors to receive help as quickly as possible." Diane slowly nodded before walking toward her car. It was not a dramatic exchange, but several residents noticed the difference in her attitude. The conversation no longer centered on authority. It centered on cooperation. Before everyone finally headed home, the delivery driver happened to pass through the neighborhood once more while completing another route. He smiled as he recognized several familiar faces and joked that he never expected an ordinary delivery day to become part of a neighborhood meeting. The lighthearted comment drew genuine laughter from the group and finally released the last bit of tension that had lingered since the weekend. As Ryan closed his garage later that evening, he realized the building itself had never been the real issue. It had simply become the place where practical kindness, clear evidence, and thoughtful neighbors quietly reminded an entire community that compassion should always have room to open every door before unnecessary rules ever try to close one. Over the next several months, life inside Maple Grove Estates gradually returned to its familiar rhythm, but anyone who had lived through that rainy Saturday could feel that the neighborhood had quietly changed. Residents still greeted one another during morning walks, children still rode bicycles along the sidewalks, and weekend projects once again filled driveways with ladders and toolboxes. The difference was not something anyone could measure. It appeared in the way neighbors looked out for one another, offered help without hesitation, and understood that ordinary kindness often mattered more than perfect appearances. The Homeowners Association introduced its revised emergency response guidelines during the next community meeting, and for the first time in years, nearly every resident agreed, without lengthy debate. The updated policy clearly explained that homeowners could voluntarily provide reasonable temporary assistance to trained emergency responders when requested, provided that access remained safe and professional operations were never interrupted. The discussion lasted only a few minutes because everyone already understood why the change mattered. Ryan Mitchell attended the meeting quietly, sitting near the back as he always had. When several neighbors thanked him afterward, he responded with the same words he had repeated since the beginning. He had simply opened a garage because someone needed help. He insisted that the real credit belonged to the emergency responders who remained calm under pressure and to the neighbors who cooperated respectfully throughout the unexpected situation. His humility only increased the respect people felt toward him. Diane Foster also approached community leadership differently after the board meeting. She became noticeably more willing to listen before making decisions, and residents gradually recognized that meetings felt more collaborative than they had in the past. Although nobody forgot what had happened, most people appreciated seeing positive changes instead of continuing old disagreements. The older resident recovered well and eventually resumed his morning walks through the neighborhood with his wife. Whenever they passed Ryan's home, they always stopped for a brief conversation, sharing smiles instead of memories of a stressful day. Their presence reminded everyone that the story had never been about winning an argument. It had always been about neighbors helping neighbors when time mattered most. The recordings that once played repeatedly during the board review were eventually stored away and rarely mentioned again. Yet the lesson they preserved remained part of the community. Facts were stronger than assumptions. Calm voices carried farther than raised ones. Practical compassion often solved problems that rules alone never could. New families moving into Maple Grove Estates occasionally heard longtime residents mention the rainy Saturday when the neighborhood discovered the importance of balancing responsibility with common sense. They did not tell the story to embarrass anyone. They shared it as an example of how an entire community chose cooperation instead of conflict after carefully listening to every perspective and allowing the evidence to guide the outcome. One quiet evening several months later, Ryan stood in his driveway as the sun settled behind the trees and watched neighbors wave to one another while children laughed nearby. He glanced at his garage, now holding nothing more remarkable than shelves, tools, and bicycles. Yet he smiled because he understood that the building itself had never changed anything. What changed the neighborhood was the simple decision to open a door when someone needed help and the willingness of ordinary people to stand by the truth with patience, respect, and compassion long after the rain had stopped.